Whatever happened to Leon Trotsky? He got an ice pick that made his ears burn. Stirring stuff. Punk rock's Mount Rushmore must include the Pistols, the Damned and the Clash. But the Stranglers always stuck out as being a bit odd, incorporating various progressive textures in their music, mining those new wave textures rather than the spit and rabid froth of the Pistols or the political call to arms of the Clash. But these days are a band that rubbed the over-censorious generation, the woke generation, up the wrong way with their blatant misogyny in numbers like Peaches, which, interestingly, Hugh Cornwell says is the first time rap appears in a rock song, not to mention Bring Out the Nubiles, which was released during the frenzied punk year of 1978. They used to perform a slower version of Nubiles to the tune of Young at Heart, which would be interesting to hear. It was called the cocktail version.
Want to love you like your dad and be your Superman.
Interestingly, J.J. Burnell appeared as a nude centerfold for Enemy that Christmas to play down the accusations of the band being chauvinist pigs. But of course the most uncomfortable and un-PC cud for us all to chow down on is the opening track of this album. I feel like a with its outward racism. Of course, you just could not make an album like that in this day and age. I mean, as Hugh Cornwell says in his autobiography, we got away with murder. Interestingly, just after No More Heroes comes out, I think about 3 weeks, David Bowie releases his seminal Berlin album, Heroes. Many have suggested that the Stranglers were privy to what Bowie was doing and kind of released their album to kind of counteract what he was saying or trying to say, being a bit punk and disorderly, I suppose. But there's no doubt the Stranglers were the elder statesmen of punk rock. They were all much older than their peers. I mean, Hugh Cornwell at the time was 28, which is 1977, of course, which is year zero for, I think, punk in the UK. Johnny Roth and Damned singer Dave Vanian both turned 21, where Stranglers drummer Jet Black, real name Brian Duffy, of course, was touching 40 at the time, and their image was gnarled and knotty. And there's no doubt that this album is a notch up from their debut. Interestingly, Trouser Press writes of the No More Heroes album, No More Heroes continues in the same vein as Rattus and Vegicus, but drops whatever hint of restraint that may have been enforced the first time around. Rude words and adult themes abound, with no punches pulled. From the blatant sexism of Bring On the Nubiles to the sarcastic attack on racism, I feel like to the of a friend, Dagenham Dave. Despite the increased virulence, the music is even better than on the debut, introducing pop stylings that would later become a more common aspect of the Stranglers' character. Many would argue their debut album, Rattus and Vegicus, establishes a kind of a new genre, art punk. I would argue Adam and the Ants, Dirk Wears White Socks belongs under that particular umbrella as well. But No More Heroes, recorded just 3 months after the debut in September 77, is nastier and faster. And let's be honest, it's much better. It's an enjoyable bit of noise, I think. As regards the unpleasant racial slur that Hugh Cornwell uses, he says in his autobiography that he used it as a kind of a shock tactic. But it was to put across a feeling, overall it was a sarcastic attack on racist attitudes that was certainly endemic in the 1970s. Interestingly, by 1976, the Stranglers were already seen as the elder statesmen of the whole sort of burgeoning British punk scene. They were even supported by the Pistols at one point. The Pistols were dismissed by J.J. Burnell as a comedy act. One of the regulars at the Stranglers gig was John Woody Mellor, a fellow pub rockers 101ers. He would, apparently quite tearful, say, "I wish I could be in a band like yours." And eventually, I think he changed his name to Joe Strummer and formed the Clash. Interestingly, when the Stranglers opened for punk poetess Patti Smith at the Roundhouse in 77, so threatened was she by them that she had her people sabotage the band's sound. Interestingly, this band goes back to 74, when they were a prog jazz hybrid, sweating blood on London's notoriously hard-to-please pub circuit. Burnell was a classically trained guitarist who would read history at university before Cornwell got him drunk and persuaded him to become the band's bassist. Jet Black owned a fleet of ice cream vans, one of which became the band's makeshift tour bus. And of course he was accompanied by jazz musician, keyboard player Dave Grenfield, who was a mustachioed piano tuner, who was a bit of a Yes fanboy. And Hugh Cornwell was a university graduate in biochemistry, whose first band he was in featured Richard Thompson. The Stranglers were seen as the darlings of the pub rock scene, and part of that whole mono-fetishist move, along with Graham Parker and the Rumour, Nick Lowe and Brinsley Schwartz. But the Stranglers began to build a faithful audience. They even had their own gang of followers called the Finchley Boys, which J.J. Burnell called their own Praetorian Guard. I suppose it would act as a kind of a security for them, perhaps. But there was the leader of the gang was called Dagenham Dave, who went on to commit by jumping off Tower Bridge into the Thames. Not a nice way to go. Hence the title of the song on the album, Dagenham Dave. Interestingly, this band were quite a hit with the old hippie crowd, who recognised, and quite rightly so, recognised in this band influences or textures borrowed from bands like The Doors and Love. But the band were busy bees, and they were beavering away on their second album, No More Heroes, while the first was still winging its way up the charts, including the first single from the second album, of course, was Something Better Change, while Peaches, of course, was still there whipping up Mary Whitehouse into a froth. Something Better Change, of course, was actually an off-cut from the first album. It's sung by J.J. Burnell. But No More Heroes, with its swirly keyboard, is the iconic track, with its references to Leon Trotsky and Sancho Panza, and the Shakespearo's, a lyric that was changed at the last minute from Helen Shapiro. Hugh Cornwell says the song was inspired by some pretty seismic cultural events at the time. He says in his autobiography, "I wrote it the same week Elvis, and then a few days later Groucho Marx died. They were my whole life, pillars of my cultural upbringing, both struck down." Of course, the swirly keyboard part of No More Heroes was borrowed by the Britpop band Elastica, their song Waking Up. Of course, the Stranglers sued, and Elastica just settled out of court. And there's a famous Top of the Pops appearance about this time, the Stranglers all playing the wrong instruments. I wonder if they got their inspiration from the surrealistic pillow sleeve. Interestingly, the album sleeve was described as chocolate boxy by one critic, which I think is an absolute nonsense. I think it's a remarkably good sleeve. And it's certainly better than the proposed original sleeve, which had J.J. Burnell alone, supposedly on Trotsky's tomb. I think that would have been was going to be the original sleeve. This, however, is a remarkably good sleeve. So No More Heroes soared to number 2 in the charts, making the Stranglers at the time arguably one of the most successful punk bands, if you can call them that. This was a band that I saw the original lineup of the Stranglers just before they finished. It would have been about 1989. I've actually got a signed copy of No More Heroes by the original lineup up in my loft. I must bring it down. But the original lineup of the Stranglers were no more after, I think, 1989. Hugh Cornwell leaves in 1990. Dave Grenfield died in 2020, and of course Jet Black died in 2022. Anyway, you've been watching a video of a classic album review. If you've enjoyed this, please share it. Other than that, do click like, subscribe, and check that notification bell. It makes all the difference to the YouTube algorithm. And check some of the links below this video for ways you can support the sterling work done at Classic Album Review. I will say thank you for watching, and I'll leave you with my closing salvo, which is, hope you're well, staying safe, and that you keep listening.